In this video, we are going to be looking at the SQL basics of select star into, specifically in the context of defaults, in the context of how that will affect the use. Now, select star into is very useful when we want to create a copy of a table quickly. A good context of this in production environments is we have a configuration table and we need to make an update to a configuration table, but we want to save a copy of that configuration table before we make an update. So we can select star into new table from configuration table, and that new table is going to be our backup table. And we can revert that in any time. And this is because it's generally very expensive to restore an entire database just for a table. And so this is one way to get around that. It can also be useful in testing, and we're going to be discussing that because there are exceptions to using it in testing, as we'll see. So in this example, what we're going to do is we're going to create a table, and this table that we see has some defaults set. First of all, we have the default of identity 1.1. We see that's a primary key. We have this region here. The default is set to A. We have the first name is 25. There's no default here on the first name. We have a row date, but it has a default of get date. We have link ID, and we see that this link ID is a foreign key, and it references copy reference, another table. Okay, so if we look at this, we see that we have this primary key, we have this foreign key, and then we have these two defaults, row date and region are defaults. First name is the only one that's not defaulted along with link ID. So what would happen if we were to select star into copied from copy this? Well, we see, and I scripted the table on the right-hand side just so we can see what it looks like, the definition, and we see on the left-hand side what it looks like in Management Studio. We'll see there's no constraints. So our region and our row date no longer have constraints to them. There's no default A and there's no default get date. Okay. And then we also see that the identity does hold, that we do see the identity 1.1 for the ID field, but it's not a primary key. Right? It's identity 1.1, that's correct, but it's not a primary key. And then we see, of course, link ID is not a foreign key. Now, why does this matter when it comes to testing? So with backups, this is very useful. We have a really good copy of data backups. So this more than likely is not going to impact us for backups of data. Keep in mind, though, if that configuration database had a foreign key reference, we can't just flip the tables by renaming the tables. I've seen people do that. That definitely works if there's no references or defaults or whatnot. Otherwise, we're going to have to update the definition of that table. Right, so keep that in mind. Usually a configuration database is not going to be having references, but it might have default values, and one of those may involve the date, right? So it won't impact us for backups of data. What I mean by that is we can still get to those data backups. Whether we're going to revert the table that way or not remains to be seen. But when it comes to testing, it depends on the context of testing. For instance, this may not impact us for backups of data testing only. If we're testing the actual data, like we're sending data to an application, and let's say we want to test the validity of our application layer. Let's say it's making sure that data are in certain ranges and that we kick out the appropriate ranges. That may be fine, but it will more than likely impact us for the testing of functionality. Why is that? Well, think about the insert behavior of data or data values where there's default specified and there's not. Likewise, think about the restrictions when it comes to, let's say, foreign keys. What would potentially occur if, let's say, something was inserted that was outside of that foreign key range? It would get an error. We wouldn't see that, though, in testing if we're testing functionality. So we have to consider these things like defaults, foreign keys. I should have put primary keys on there as well. And that does have an impact on the behavior. So select star into the situation in which I was observing, the developers were wondering why they were having a problem, and it's because they're testing when the problem was revealed, they weren't testing ceteris paribus, right? It's not like, okay, we're going to do this one thing on this side and this other thing. In the case of the select star into, you had two tables that appeared to be the same, but they were testing functionality. And because there were defaults and foreign keys defined on one table and there weren't on the other, there were issues. So we want to definitely consider the context of what we're using behind select star into. This is where you'll sometimes hear people that are kind of negative on it. For good reason, it's because it can sometimes lead people into thinking, oh, I have an exact copy. It's like, while that's true on the data side, it's not true on the functionality or the schema side as well. Now, again, for backups of data, I still think this is definitely an effective technique. The exception to that is if the table is very large. Keep in mind this is a write operation. Keep in mind the person who's running this is going to have to be able to have permissions to create a table. There's a whole other context as well as far as permissions. But as far as the testing of functionality, we want to be extremely careful because it's possible it won't affect us, but just be aware if we use this and we're A/B testing and we want to have a clone of the table, it might be good to clone the table by scripting and even having the appropriate cloned references as well. That's a much more accurate test than just doing a select star into.